Thanks, Arlen. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everyone who's here today. I actually see some colleagues I know in the chat, so thanks everyone for introducing themselves. It helps me understand who's here in the room today, and I appreciate everyone attending. If you're not familiar with the Center for Talent Development, we are a prong of the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, and we exist to serve K-12 students and educators in the gifted and talent development advanced learner space. We have a wide range of programming. We also provide professional learning, consulting, program reviews, curriculum resources, and assessment guidance for advanced learners across the board. So if you're not familiar with us, I'd encourage you to jump on our website and take a look at some of the work that we do. We do work on a talent development model, and if you're not familiar with that, we essentially work from that philosophy of challenge through advanced enrichment and acceleration. But also supporting that psychosocial skill development that we know is so crucial for students, that self-confidence, those mindsets, resilience, and teachability. That's sort of the philosophy and the mindset that we work through. For our webinar today, we have kind of an ambitious agenda. I put together a lot of slides, and we're going to move rather quickly because I feel like all of these topics are pertinent and important, but I also don't want to rush too quickly through topics that may be of specific importance to you. So if we get to a topic and you want to ask a question in the chat, please feel free to do so. Like Arlen said, we will reserve some time at the end today for specific Q&A, but I'm more than happy to address questions that come up as we go along. I'm also going to ask you to respond yes or respond no, or throw some context into the chat as well, so I don't feel like I'm sitting here for an hour chatting with myself. But the agenda that we'll work from today will be sort of talking a little bit about assessment literacy and data literacy in general, because it's a very important topic. We want to talk a little bit about a data culture as well. In the fall here, it's really important that we talk about some of these data collection pieces as we move through making decisions that feel like they're high stakes for students with our data constructs. We'll talk a little bit about assessment for identification and services, growth and goals for advanced learners specifically, and then assessment for learning readiness. So that's where we'll land at the end of our time today. I always like to start with, perception versus reality. For those of you, and I do see there are a couple assessment professionals and leaders in the webinar today. When you work in the assessment world and education and you tell people what you do for a living, this is sort of the face that they give us. And the reason that a lot of individuals have that perception about education assessment is we've created a toxic culture around it. And that does exist here in the state of Illinois. Over the last 20 years, education assessment's gotten a really bad rap. There's been a lot of really poor things written about it. In all full disclosure, as we all know, we haven't done it really well all of the time. And so when we talk about assessment, sometimes we have to break down these barriers of fear and resistance, both for leaders and educators, but also for our parents and our students. So I just want to start with that today, that we know that this exists and we want to work to sort of break down some of those barriers that exist in our assessment culture. What I want to talk about first is, do you have good data? Before we start talking about data applications, measuring achievement and growth are only as good as our data sets that exist. So how do you ensure that you have quality data for decision making? And I think my general question to you all in the webinar today is, do you know if you have good data to make decisions? Is anybody out there 100% confident and can put yes in the chat that says, yeah, I know that I have really good data constructs? And sometimes, thanks, Anthony, I see a lot of those. Sometimes the answer is no. And it's also okay if the answer is I don't know. Sometimes we're not sure if the data that we've collected is really indicative of what our students are able to do and what they know. And so those are some things we want to talk through for a minute before we get to how we want to apply those data constructs. Is it good? We know we have a lot of quantitative data. Most of the school systems that I work with and see have a lot of data. There's a great volume. There are a lot of different assessments that are given inside of schools. So we have lots of different ways and lenses and filters to look at students. But we're not always sure if that's top quality data. So how can we ensure that we've collected data that makes a lot of sense as we make decisions on behalf of our students? When we think about creating a culture that sustains quality data, we definitely want to start at the top with stable test conditions. The way we give tests and the way we put tests in front of students makes a difference. Test conditions include things like the test environment, the time of day that we're giving tests to kids, how much time are students spending on the test, both too little time, and for those of you who give interim assessments like MAP, is it too much time? And that's a big conversation for advanced learners. Is there anyone in the room today that has an advanced learner mindset oftentimes where students want to spend way too much time on their MAP test? Has anybody experienced that? Yeah, sometimes that's a really difficult habit to break. Uh, Too little time on test tends to be a environmental condition, oftentimes with our proctors. Too much time on the test is also a social emotional construct for a lot of kids. Other test conditions that are really important are things like device proficiency, student preparation, the quality and fidelity of our internet, and then practice before we put students on assessments. And yeah, I said let's practice. We want our students to be as prepared as possible when they sit down to take the assessment. We want them to know what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, and we want them to be proficient on the devices that they're using. System buy-in is also crucial. Uh, I'm reading Anthony's question. One thing about that, the rapid guessing is stopping. Yeah. The rapid guessing technology is great. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like that on the long side, so that makes it a social emotional construct for us to move students along more quickly. But system buy-in includes those things like a positive outlook and positive words and conversations about assessment. We want our leaders talking positively about assessments with our teachers, and we want teachers talking positively about assessments with students and families. We want to create a very, very positive outlook before students sit down to work on an assessment. When we think about assessment literacy, it's really important that leaders and administrators support and build teacher capacities to engage with students, to engage with parents, that everyone understands what the test measures and what we're going to do with that test when we're done with it. A lot of times when I provide trainings for schools and leaders, I challenge them with this question. If I walked into your building, regardless of what test we're taking, and asked any teacher in the hallway, why do you give MAP? Why do you give STAR? Why do you give iReady? Why do we give IAR? Would they be able to tell me, and would they be able to tell me what it measures? And then the next question I ask is, what if I stopped any student in your building and asked that same question? And if the answer is no, all of my teachers can't do that, or no, all of my students can't do that, it's okay, but it means that we have some work to do in terms of our assessment literacy and our system buy-in from both our staff and our students. Data literacy is also crucial. It's really important that we give the assessment well and we know what it is, but it's just as important that we know what the data means and we know how to use it. And that is going to fall on leadership in providing professional learning opportunities, both for leaders and for teachers to understand that data and all of its applications, both from making decisions about service programming, which we'll talk a little bit about today, all the way down to what we're going to talk about the end, informing instruction and interventions in the classroom. And then for me, number 5 is the most important piece of this culture, is creating instructional competencies for our educators. We want to use the data to flex the group and inform instruction and intervention, and be able to measure growth and effective programs. And this creates a cycle. It takes a while to create a pretty robust quality data culture, but as we work through these things, we start to realize that we'll have better data upon which to make decisions on behalf of our kids. When we think about data literacy and their applications inside of schools, I highlighted the ones in purple today because these are the ones that will be most pertinent to our conversations about advanced learners. So student placement and programming, it's crucial that we have data literacy for our decision makers as we make decisions about identification for services and for students who are going to qualify for intervention. Especially when we get to school system and accountability, proficiency and growth is incredibly important that we have data literacy in those areas. Today, we're going to talk specifically about growth for advanced students. And then those classroom applications are crucial, guiding and planning instruction, grouping, compacting, and then applying those interventions for students. So we could spend an entire hour, we could probably spend an entire day talking about identification. That's not really the full scope of this webinar today, but we do want to ask the question, are we finding the right kids to serve? Do we have identification constructs in place that locate the kids who need something different than their more average peers in our system? How does your system identify students for talent development services? This isn't rhetorical, but does everyone in the room know and understand your identification system to find students for whatever your gifted talent development advanced learner services look like? Is that a yes? Is that a no? And I know it sounds silly, but oftentimes when we talk, sometimes we talk with gifted and talent development educators, they don't always know how students were identified for the programs that they're teaching. So I asked that question seriously. If you're not familiar with your identification structure and you don't know how students go through a process inside of your school system to be identified for advanced learner services, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I'm going to share really briefly Programming Standard 2 from NAGC, which deals specifically with assessment and more specifically with identification best practices for schools. And as we walk through these, I want you to either think about your system and compare your practices to these recommendations from NAGC, or take these practices as you see them today and then apply them when you look up your identification structure and see if your school system is participating in best practice. The first identification standard really speaks to equal access in the identification process. When you look at your student population that you have identified that needs advanced learner services, we want to ensure that that demographic looks like and mirrors the demographic of your school system. One way to ensure that is early exposure for all students to enrichment before assessment. Whenever your assessment construct begins, we want to think ahead of that. 1 grade, 2 grades, 3 grades, however early it could possibly be. And we want to expose students to advanced enrichment, problem solving opportunities for all students before assessment begins. We want to prepare students for the opportunity that they may have. Everybody knows that not every student shows up to school as ready as the next student. So we want to sort of level that playing field this way. We also want to prepare parents for identification and the assessment process. We want them to know and understand what that looks like. Here at the Center for Talent Development, we do a lot of program reviews for school systems. And as we survey stakeholders, one of the things we hear quite a bit is that parents don't always understand the identification process, and there's a breakdown in the communication. So we want to ensure that parents know well ahead of assessment what that identification process looks like. And then we also want to implement universal screening. Most schools today do a really good job of that because almost everybody gives it some sort of interim assessment, and we can use those interim assessments for dual purpose here. We want to use that as a universal screener to cast a wide net of students that we would then perhaps put on an additional assessment to identify them for the programs and services that you offer in your system. The second part of this programming standard is to really think about services that match student talents. And a lot of times we ask the question, do you have services and a number of seats allocated and then find students to fill those seats? Or do you find student needs and identify those and then allocate seats and services based on student needs? So there are two different ways to take a look at that. But in either case, we want to ensure that we're matching student abilities and needs to the services that we're providing. We need to do that through creating reliable policies, having really quality, robust assessment choices. We want to implement those quality assessments and use them in multiple ways. If we're going to use it as a universal screener and as an interim, we also want to build our teachers' capacity to use it on behalf of kids in the classroom for informing instruction. We want to implement above grade level assessment or a differentiated assessment model. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we move through and talk about measuring growth. We want to eliminate bias as much as possible in our assessment process, and I know that's a bigger conversation. We want to acknowledge our 2E students. Oftentimes we see that 2E students are precluded from consideration for advanced learner services because of their other exceptionalities, and we want to make sure that they are part of this process as well. We want to create that data literacy, and we, again, want to communicate this process with parents. The third layer of this, that identification represents diverse backgrounds. We want to make sure, remember we talked about that early enrichment in the first part of these standards. We want to front load opportunities and use universal screening, and if necessary or if appropriate, we want to use local norms. If your school district's demographics and achievement profile don't look like national norms, then local norms may be a really good fit for you as you look for students who need something different. And we want to adhere to state and local policy. We know that Illinois has some legislation that requires us to have policy around acceleration and early entrance to kindergarten and first grade. We want to ensure that all of our leaders are on board and understand that policy, and that our policies we create in our school systems are adhering to that at the legislative level. Learning process and use of multiple ongoing assessments to measure appropriate growth. That's why that's part of what we're going to talk about today. That use of ongoing assessment, using performance-based assessment and FEL indicators. Not every assessment in our portfolio has to be a standardized assessment that has national norms, and that's okay. We want to use assessments to plan and deliver appropriate services and instructions, and we keep coming back to this theme of share data with parents. And the last part of this is the learning process and having students assess and own their own learning. And that's really important. And that sometimes is a layer that we find is missing in a lot of school systems. So providing opportunities for students to understand their data, to understand their growth, to be a participant in setting their goals and assessing their goals as they move through content and curriculum. And as we sort of leave the identification conversation, I like to put this slide up because I want us to think through the difference between students that are underrepresented in our service programs and then students who may be underserved. When we think underrepresented, what that tells us is that we may not be casting a wide enough net. We may not be considering all of the students who we could consider. Students don't have access to service for whatever reason. That assessment is too limited, or we need an alternative and we may need to differentiate that. That students could be underexposed to rigorous content. Language barriers exist in a lot of our school systems. If you have a system that has a lot of EL students, you could find that they may be vastly underrepresented in your advanced learner programs. There's no funding or access for exposure. It sounds great to talk about applying all of these early exposure programs, but we know that all of that comes at a cost, and that our process doesn't use local norms. Again, if your system doesn't look like national norms, using local norms might help you find less underrepresentation. But then there's also this idea of underservice. So we may have found students, but the identification does not match the service program. We may know that students are very talented in math, but we have either accelerated them or we're enriching them across the board. Program is one size fits all. If we have one service for all students, regardless of their achievement level, we may be underserving some of those students with that construct, that students aren't engaged or motivated. We aren't going to have a lot of time to talk about it today, but there's a new idea that I've been talking about a lot, that there's a difference between engagement and challenge. And some students who are good at school and who enjoy school and who are very social oftentimes have a very active affective engagement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those students are being challenged at the appropriate curriculum level. So it's something to think about, that if students who aren't engaged and aren't motivated, perhaps they're not challenged in the appropriate way, that services are not connected to curriculum or goals. Sometimes we see that, especially in pull-out programs, that kids come out of regular classrooms, then they're no longer exposed to curriculum along a continuum of standards. And so we want to ensure that whatever's happening in a pull-out program is as aligned to curriculum as classroom instruction is. That staff has not received formal training, gifted and talented best practices. So if we have teachers teaching courses, but they haven't had training on how to serve advanced learners, especially if our model is differentiation at tier 1 in the classroom, we really want to make sure we provide that for teachers. That the volume and intensity of the service is too low, and student is close to service criteria, but not included. So these are those kids that are on the bubble. They didn't qualify for the service program, but we know they need something different. How do we provide that for those students so that they don't continue to be underserved? So those are just some things to get you thinking. Before we move on and talk about service programs, are there any questions about any of these layers of assessment and identification that we've gone over so far? Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat, so let's move on. So how are you serving your high ability learners? It doesn't really matter what we call them, but we want to consider what our services are for them. There's no one right way to label our programs, but whatever we do, we want to think about what is our service or our continuum, our menu of services look like. I love to share this graphic because it gets us thinking about services to what I like to say, to the right here for kids who are above. In the same sort of vein and way we think about students who are still working towards grade level. We know that tier 1 is that place where we are implementing good differentiation, where students' needs are being met in the classroom, teachers are using flexible grouping, teachers are using differentiated materials to meet their needs. As students in a typical MTSS or RTI model would move here, we know that tier 2 services are more intensive and therefore a smaller group of kids, and that tier 3 are reserved for those students who have the most intensive needs. We want to apply that same thought process on the other side of the spectrum, that if students need more than just tier 1 classroom differentiation, what does a tier 2 service look like for advanced learners? How do we define that? How do we set up a construct to identify students for that? And then do we have a way to identify students who have the most intense needs compared to their peers and provide a service model and or level that fits for them? Often the types of services that we see and we measure for are differentiation in the classroom, of course, something that we also see a lot of now more than ever, and we're going to talk about this later, is even inside of our selective enrollment or advanced learner programs, we see a much greater need for differentiation than possibly we ever have, because students are exhibiting much more different learning readiness from each other than they have, especially prior to the pandemic. We can use enrichments and extensions, and we're going to talk a bit about what that looks like in either in the regular classroom or as a tier 1 intervention today. Oftentimes school systems are still using pull-out programs. What does that look like, and how are you defining that? What does the structure and what are the standards and curriculum for that is something I want to just put on everybody's radar. How is your pull-out program constructed? Flexible grouping or cluster grouping is also really popular. Being mindful of grouping kids that have like readinesses together, self-contained or selective enrollment classes. This could be, at grade level, or if you have a selective enrollment school, a gifted school in your system, we see that quite a bit. And then there's acceleration. And I know here in the state of Illinois, there are lots and lots of different thoughts on acceleration and lots of different ways that we come to it. So I wanted to just put a slide up here to talk about what are the most common acceleration applications Early kindergarten and entrance to first grade is one way that we see acceleration practiced here. Whole grade acceleration, which we also know is grade skipping oftentimes, is something that we see. Subject acceleration has become rather popular, especially in mathematics. We see that quite a bit, and not just 1 year of subject acceleration, but we see very responsive 2 and 3 years acceleration in mathematics in some places. Compressed courses where students are completing the same amount of content in a much shorter time duration. Telescoped where kids are focusing on certain parts of content because they have mastered other pieces of it. Kids are working at their own pace, or mastery-based credit where there's credit flexibility where students can kind of compact out of having to take specific courses because they can demonstrate mastery. Just by by a yes or no, how many districts in here use either whole grade or subject acceleration as a practice for your advanced learners inside your school system on a regular basis? Good. Subject acceleration practice regularly. And you may be in a school system where subject acceleration is it's not an intervention, it's part of your service model, that you have courses that are designed to be a whole grade level ahead for some students at some grade levels. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so then we have an essential question here. So our student needs align to services, and how do we know? Do you feel confident that the students that you're finding are well aligned to the program services that you have? Do any of you find students that are either over ready or under ready for instruction, even inside of your advanced learner or selective enrollment programs? Do you find that at all? Anybody? Yeah, both depending on the grade and the subject. That's probably true. So let's talk about alignment for a little bit. So what is learning readiness? We're all familiar with ZPD. We all understand that concept. It's that place where things instruction learners can do with help. They don't know it all, but they know enough to be able to engage with it. Here at CTD, we also have another ZPD, and that's the zone of possible differentiation. When we look at the spread in our classroom, we look at learning readiness. How much differentiation is realistic for one teacher as we measure how far away are students from the standards that are to be taught at either at that program level or the grade level, and what's realistic for that teacher to consider in terms of possible differentiation and responsive instruction. Do you find teachers in your systems struggling sometimes to differentiate across the wide range of learner readiness inside your classrooms? Very much. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Allie. So why does ZPD matter so much? Why is readiness so crucial and so important? Readiness has a direct impact on growth. Erin says it seems like a bad word at times, but they don't know what it means, right? Yeah, and sometimes it's okay if teachers don't own all of the tools we want them to have in their toolkit, right? We as leaders oftentimes have to do some assessment and help them put those tools in that toolkit, right? But that's a great call out to say that out loud, Erin. But readiness has a direct impact on growth. And so when we start thinking about growth in our advanced learner data sets, and it's looking less than robust, oftentimes we want to look back to alignment in ZPD and say, are our kids' learning readiness well aligned to what we're teaching inside of our programs? And if the answer is no, whether kids are over ready or under ready, oftentimes it's going to show itself in a lack of growth. And so that's something for us to think about as we think about our selective enrollment programs. So how do you determine, and these are real questions, so I'd just love for somebody to risk it and throw some answers into the chat for me, but how do you determine success of your programming? And are advanced learners growing in your system, and how do you know? Those are some things for us to think about. If there's somebody who absolutely knows their advanced learners are growing and you know why, if you would throw that in the chat, I know we would all be very, very grateful. Or is that the reason everybody's here today? A lot of times when we're working with, regional service centers or even State Department of Eds, and we ask this question of school systems, we'll say, well, are your advanced learners growing? And oftentimes the answer is no, but they aren't sure why. And then deconstructing that is really crucial. Oftentimes as well, some of our systems don't track the effect of their programming. Right? Let's see, Stephanie says, yes, I don't feel we have a good system for assessing growth. NWA is the biggest assessment. We only have one section of advancement, so we don't have a great to demonstrate growth, right? We can look at that section of advanced math there and say, what do they look like? Can we track them over time? Are we finding that there's stagnated growth? What do they look like growing compared to their more average peers? So all of those things make good questions. I don't know if we have 100% perfect answers to that stuff, but it's really important to know this question: how does your system define student growth? If they just, you may only use IAR in the Illinois proficiency growth model. That may be your only growth model in your system. So that may be how your school system defines growth. You may choose to use an interim assessment to define growth. You may employ a company like ECRA to work through multiple layers of assessment to take a look at student growth. There are so many different models, but it's really important to ask the question, how does your system define student growth? Because it's really difficult for us to answer the question, are our advanced learners growing, if we don't know what we're comparing it to. Thanks, Ellie. We look at IAR and MAP, but not sure that's enough. We're exploring interims and that's what I'm perfect. Thanks for sharing that. So knowing how you define it is crucial. We have to get to that point. And then how does your student measure student growth, right? So defining it and measuring it can be very different, but also kind of to Ellie's point here, the difference between growth and adequate growth based on goals, right? Adequate growth is something that is really subjective, and we have to define that for ourselves inside of our system. But thinking about serving your advanced learners, does your system measure program effectiveness? And what I mean by that is, do we look at growth of individual students, which is really important? And do we look at growth of individual students over time, which is also important? We don't want to use one growth measure as an end-all be-all for a determination of the student growing or not, but that trajectory over time, that body of work while they're with us sort of tells us the tale. But when we talk about program effectiveness, we want to look at the growth of our cohorts. How's the whole group doing? And then we also want to look at cohorts over time. How have our groups moved and grown over time? Because it's really important. We want to ask questions like curriculum and readiness alignment. Is our curriculum that we're teaching aligned to the readiness of the students that we're putting in that program? Because that can also make our effectiveness look less robust. Student satisfaction is something that we should be measuring. If you're not using a student survey or asking those questions to students, is this difficult for you? Is this too easy for you? Is this class challenging? Are you engaged? Those are things that will help us understand program effectiveness. And teacher satisfaction. It's kind of important for us to gauge that as well. If you look at your systems, and I see this a lot, especially at junior high, and you've been doing the same thing for the last 15 years, it might be time to take a look at the alignment of those programs and the robustness of what that service looks like for students, because a lot of things have changed over the last 15 years, both in practice and curriculum and students. So we know that achievement and growth are different, that achievement is what a student can demonstrate at one point in time, and that growth is that movement between 2 points in time. But what I want to say out loud today is for advanced learners, that continuous high achievement is not a substitute for understanding growth and effective programming. Because they stay high, because they still have high percentiles, that's not a substitute for understanding the effect that our programming is having on that student, and are we growing them at an adequate or better rate. We don't necessarily want to only settle for average growth for students who we know oftentimes learn more quickly and assimilate more quickly. And we're going to come to a slide on that in a second. This may be controversial, but I'm going to say it out loud anyway, that growth projections, whether they're MAP or STAR or iReady, are not intended to be growth goals. A lot of school systems use them as growth goals. Sometimes they translate into growth goals. That's true. But growth projections are descriptive statistics. They describe what is in a data set. They're not a prescriptive statistic that lead us to believe this is what we should do with our students. If we only use an average growth projection for our advanced learners, we may underserve them in terms of the growth that they could possibly make over a period of time, because we're using a description of what has happened, not a prescription for where they are in terms of their readiness. How robust is our program? How quickly could we move through this content? Are we able to compact them out of some things because we're finding that they already know some of the standards? I want you to consider this, that we know advanced learners have the ability to assimilate more quickly, learn more quickly, move through content more quickly, delve deeper. They can accelerate, they can telescope, we can compact for them. Yet, those of you who are familiar with data sets and growth percentiles and projections from nationally normed assessment data sets, we know that our advanced learners, or our highest achievers, are the slowest growers in those data sets, despite knowing this about who they are as learners. So it's something for us to think about. If we know this about advanced learners, but we only look at probably an under-projected average growth projection, we're going to continue to underserve those kids. So let's use growth projections as context and not necessarily translate those into growth goals for advanced learners. I'd like to share this achievement and growth example because oftentimes this happens to a lot of our advanced learners. On test 1, a student might have a score of 210 and puts them at the 97th percentile. And that's great. So we know they're a high achiever. They may be part of our advanced learner program set. We're moving them through. On test 2, whenever that happens to be, oftentimes across an interim assessment, this might be a winter testing opportunity. 0 to 216. So if we only look at their scale score, we know that they grew from a 210 to 216. So they grew 6 points. That's great. But when we look at their percentile ranking, they've now gone from the 97th to the 93rd percentile. So what that is a symptom of undergrowth. They grew, but they didn't grow at an average rate. And so now they're dropping status. You don't have to answer this in the chat, but you can answer this to yourself. How many of you know some parent in your school that if they got their students' assessment report and they saw a drop from the 97th to the 93rd percentile, somebody in your school is getting a phone call? And what we want to be able to do is empower our teachers and our administrators to answer that phone call and say, as Stephanie says, absolutely, we know they're going to call and ask about that. So how do we empower our teachers and our administrators to answer that question and say, yeah, for this data point, they did grow, but it's less than average. So what we want to think about next time is overgrowing that average. But too often, on test number 3, they score 218. So we have net growth of 8 points. They grew another 2 points. The scale score is still going up, and our percentile ranking is still going down. they're still undergrowing average and they're still dropping. Percentile ranking. And then test number 4, they're at a 221. Again, still demonstrating technical growth, but we're still dropping percentile ranking. And so over the course of a year and one assessment point, we have a student that's gone from the 97th to the 84th percentile and looks much more average, when in actuality, they're really underachieving compared to where they've been before. They may be underachieving compared to ability data that we may have on this student. And it's likely a symptom of underservice, that we are undershooting their learning readiness and we're just not stimulating growth at a fast enough pace for a student in this scenario. So if you're seeing this, what I would encourage you to do is really take a look at the alignment of your student readiness versus the curriculum in the classroom or in the service program where you have students. The other thing I really want to talk about quickly here is the limits of the 99th percentile. And a lot of our advanced learners sit and live in the 99th percentile, and it's important for them to be there. But I wanted to share this example with you, and this is a student that we work with. This is a 3rd grader who has a fall math score of 244. And we know this kid's in the 99th percentile. But what I did was I pulled the distribution and we took a look that the 99th percentile for a 3rd grader in the fall starts at 220. So what we know about learning readiness for this student at 244 and classroom peers who are at 220, they're both in the 99th percentile, but they're 24 skill score points away and they're not ready for the same instruction. They're very, very different learners. And if we're only looking at percentile ranking in this case, we will want to put these kids together in the same group, and that's not necessarily appropriate. So I asked the same question. They asked the question, what if this student were a 4th grader? The threshold for 99th percentile in 4th grade is 233. So this student is still in the 99th percentile compared to 4th graders and compared to 5th graders. They would be in the 96th to 97th percentile compared to 6th graders, and in the 91st percentile if we compare them to 7th graders. Now, this is definitely not a suggestion that we would move a 3rd grader to 7th grade math. That's not what this is about. But what this is a suggestion of is that this student is not ready for 3rd grade mathematics, probably not ready for 4th grade mathematics, and likely not ready for 5th grade mathematics. We need to do some more formative diagnostic assessment to best understand where the student's really ready to learn in terms of their math readiness, because it's not in the 3rd grade classroom at 3rd grade standards. So the 99th percentile takes a little bit more investigation for us when we get there, because we want to understand how far into the 99th percentile are students functioning. With students that happen to be in the ether like that, we want to understand that sometimes it's okay to differentiate assessment. And this is one of my favorite cartoons to put up. And if you've ever been in a session with me before, I know you've seen this. But as we think about, assessing kids, especially high achievers, everybody has to take the same test for a fair selection. This is how different all of our students are. And we know that if we were to give each one of these animals the same assessment to climb this tree, that they're not all going to do very well. So sometimes it's okay for us to differentiate our assessment for our high achievers, knowing that it's not wholly appropriate to give them the same assessment that their more average achieving peers are taking. I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with above grade level assessment or talent search, but I just wanted to share this case study to show you what it looks like when we use differentiated assessment. All 4 of these students in this scenario are in the same advanced service program. They all met the base criteria to be there and were placed into the program, so they went through the identification process. They all scored proficient or better on their 7th grade proficiency exam, and they are all historically in the 90th percentile or above on their interim assessment. So when this group of students took their 7th grade advanced interim ELA performance assessment, they are all here indicated by the blue arrows. It makes sense that this class looks very high performing because this is an honors ELA class. So most of the kids in here are very high performing. They all look ready for the same instruction, right? Well, what we did was we gave this class, this 8th grade class, the SAT. So they took the SAT. which isn't designed for 7th or 8th graders. It's designed for 11th and 12th graders. So what we did was we raised the ceiling of the assessment that we were giving them. And what we found was that they do not look the same anymore, that their learning readiness is varied and very different, even though they're all placed into the same advanced learner program. These 4 arrows are exactly the same for students. What we do at Northwestern is we've redistributed these kids and we've compared them only to other 8th graders who have taken the SAT. Right. So we know that students here in the purple and the orange, based on research over years, are probably pretty well placed in this honors class. It's probably right size for them. It's probably challenging for them. They know enough to really engage with the content and be well served. Our students in the yellow and the green are probably a little underserved in this honors class. They are ready for more. And this teacher should probably be providing some pretty robust differentiation for these kids that are here. Our students in the red are probably very underserved here and are likely a candidate for acceleration. And we should consider reprogramming those students into a different environment, because this assessment is telling us that they have mastered content that's well beyond the scope of the honors program that they're in. Let's see, sorry, a few more minutes. So that's thinking about using differentiated assessment. We want to talk a little bit about using assessment for responsive planning. How many of you in here, and you can just, oh, you're using a graphic, I'm not seeing it. Oh, I'm sorry if you weren't seeing my graphic, Arlen, I don't know if there was a problem. But using assessment for responsive planning, how many of you have teachers, or you as a teacher, use pre-assessment in your system? I'm gonna go back. Is anybody, are we having difficulty seeing the slides, Arlen?
No, it's looking good for me, Melissa.
Okay, all right. Maureen, I'm sorry. We will be sending out the slide deck to you tomorrow, so take a look for that. If there's something that you've missed, you can like slide back through it. But are your teachers using pre-assessment? One thing that we want to think about is, what does your data say about readiness for instruction, and how ready are your kids for the instruction that's coming? And we want to talk a bit about who's ready, who's under ready, and who's over ready, right? And we have those in every classroom, whether they're just heterogeneous classrooms in our schools or whether they're in our selective enrollment programs. We want to talk about managing multiple levels of readiness. How do we remedy under readiness? How do we remedy over readiness, which is a challenge, right? Stephanie, I'll get to that in 1 second, right? Of what pre-assessments are good. In this graphic, this sort of is what happens where we give an assessment, right? And this could be our own curriculum-based pre-assessment. It could be using our interim assessment as a pre-assessment. But we know that if this is our target for instruction, we have all these red kids who aren't close, all these yellow kids who are very ready, and all of the green kids who are not quite, or who are over ready. So how do we think about preparing for these students? Over ready has existed for a really long time, right? So what is an extension and what is enrichment? How do we challenge these gifted and talented students without giving them extra work or putting something new on their plate? We want to allow them to apply knowledge in a new way that's not repetitive, and we want to give them their own educational experiences, right? What do we do if students are always over ready? We want to start thinking about acceleration, right? If they're always over ready every single time we come to a project or a placement, and they always know, and we're always applying enrichments and enrichments and extensions for them, chances are they're underserved, and we want to think about gathering some more data and thinking about acceleration for those students. What do we do for kids who aren't quite ready? Pre-assessment is awesome, right? But when do teachers most often give pre-assessment? They often give it the Friday before the unit starts on Monday. I know I did that when I was teaching, and I've seen that across my career. What I'm going to suggest here with this calendar that I'm going to show you is deliberate pre-assessment on an earlier timeline, so that we know ahead of time that kids aren't ready, and we can truly scaffold them into instruction, versus knowing they're not ready on Friday, dragging them through instruction Monday through Friday. When they don't do well in the summative assessment, we're surprised and then we want to reteach. The scaffolding would be in lieu of reteaching at the end of a unit for kids who weren't quite ready. So stay with me for just a minute here. But if this is the unit start date on a Monday, and this is our typical pre-assessment date, what I would suggest for responsive planning would be back your calendar up 4 weeks because you know what's coming on your curriculum map. Give your responsive pre-assessment here. And then for all of those students who are in the red, all the ones who weren't quite ready yet, this gives us the opportunity over the course of the next couple of weeks to implement some very short cycle intervention types of preparatory lessons to scaffold their readiness so that when we get to this unit start date, we've front loaded that intervention and we've prepared them and made them more ready than they would have been had we done our typical pre-assessment just the day or two before we started instruction, right? Where do we see the most benefit for this? Teachers are able to unit and lesson plan. They can provide better differentiated assessment. How do they swing all of this though? This I want you to take a look at when you get the slides because I definitely want to leave some time open for questions, but we want to do this as a systemic collaboration, to have one teacher trying to plan all of these small lessons by themselves in a silo is overwhelming. So if we have 4 teachers at a grade level, how do we collaboratively plan for readiness lessons? Because we know we're going to have the same students who aren't quite ready unit over unit, year over year. For the kids who are over ready, what if each unit had a built-in extension, curriculum-based, standards-aligned enrichment or extension that was already prepared for each unit so that those students had something different and of great value to do in lieu of more work or extra work when they finish their typical work at the end of a unit. And then it creates some flexibility for us. It gives us the ability to use data analysis and responsive assessment for each kid as they demonstrate readiness for instruction. Right, so I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and I'll start with Stephanie's if that's okay. So what are some examples of good pre-assessments you can use if you are really familiar with your interim assessment and their learning readiness indicators? Those are a great place to start looking at student learning readiness. You can take a look at those and see how well aligned they are to your curriculum, because remember, your curriculum stays standard. All of those things, learning continuum, learning statements, all of those things that come from your interim assessments, those are context about how ready your kids are for instruction. Your curriculum tells you what you're going to teach, and those assessments let you know how ready kids are for instruction. If you're seeing that you have kids that look like they're really far away from readiness, I would use some curriculum-based measures, some of the layers and pieces that come in your curriculum or are part of your formative or summative assessment construct to really see, are they that far away from instruction, or is the interim assessment telling us something that isn't quite as diagnostic as we want it to be? But using your curriculum materials are great ways to have pre-assessments. Having your teachers combine their power and their knowledge and create short cycle pre-assessments for each unit as those units come along is really helpful. That way you don't have one student in one classroom getting really robust pre-assessment and responsive planning and another student in another classroom who everybody just gets whole group instruction regardless of what their readiness looks like. Other questions? Looks like that might be it, Arlen.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing these strategies for advanced data for advanced learners. Thanks to all of our attendees as well. As I said in the beginning, this was recorded. I'll be sending out a link to the recording and the evaluation tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. And I think we're going to get Melissa's slides as well. Is that correct, Melissa?
Yes, I'm happy to send them along.
Okay, you share those with me and I'll put them into a PDF form.
Yep.
That way it's easy for everybody to download.
Sure. Yep, that sounds good.
All right, thanks everyone. You are free
Thank you,
to
everyone.
log out. If you hover down the lower right-hand corner of your screen on Zoom, you'll see a big red button to leave the meeting room. You're free to click that now, and that will log you out of the session for this afternoon. Thanks again, Melissa.
Thanks.